I carried the oath ring of Stonereach the length of the Great Hall in my 2 hands, and 400 people watched me do it, and not one of them understood what they were about to feel. It was heavy. That is the thing nobody puts in the story afterward. It was iron and old gold, and it weighed like a stone, and it was moving in my hands, humming, hard enough that I could feel it in the bones of my wrists and up into my elbows, and I had perhaps 40 paces to walk, and I did not know whether my grip would last them. Behind me a king was standing entirely alone on his own dais because no living soul had been able to bear standing near him in 3 years. I got to the doors. I got them open with my shoulder, and I carried that ring out into the cold of the yard, and I set it down on the flags, and I turned around to look back into the hall. 400 people were staring at their king the way you stare at a stranger. 9 weeks earlier, I had reached up and put my hand on the face of the most feared alpha in the north, and told him he looked lonely, because I had no idea I was supposed to be afraid of him. My name is Ida, and I cut letters into stone. I was 25 that autumn, and I had been deaf since I was 2, which is long enough that I do not remember hearing and have never once found it a loss. I want that at the front. A great many people in this account will treat my deafness as the saddest thing about me, and they will all be wrong, and it will get several of them into a great deal of trouble. I speak. My voice is flat and does not go up or down, and I am told it is unsettling. I have known this since I was 9, and have decided it is other people's business to get used to it. I read mouths, which I have done since I was small, and which is a skill, not a magic. I catch perhaps 3 words in 4, in good light, on a face I know, and considerably less on a stranger with a beard, and anyone who tells you a lip reader knows everything has never watched one guess wrong in front of a room. And I have hand speech, which my mother built with me when I was 3, and which my whole family uses, and which is the language I actually think in. I cut letters because my father cut letters, and because it is a trade for people who look. You cannot cut a name into stone by ear. That is what brought me to Stonereach Keep in the autumn of my 25th year, the roll. The Great Hall at Stonereach has a wall, the whole north wall, floor to the rafters, carved with the names of every house sworn to the crown, 400 years of them, cut in order. When a house swears, its name goes on the wall. It is the largest single inscription in the north, and it had not been properly maintained in a generation, and I had won the contract to recut the worn courses and open the fresh ones, which was the best work I had ever been given, and which I expected to take me most of a year. So I lived on a scaffold above that hall for 9 weeks, chisel in hand, watching the entire government of a territory conduct itself 30 feet below me. Here is the thing about a room like that, when you are the only person in it who cannot hear. Everyone believes that lowering your voice makes you private. Everyone, ranked lords, clerks, the king's own council, they drop their voices, they turn their shoulders, they lean in, and they believe with complete confidence that the business is now between them, because that is what a lifetime of being heard teaches you about how secrets work. Nobody ever thinks about the woman on the scaffold. Nobody thinks about her at all, and if they do, they think. She cannot hear us. I was not spying. I want to be honest. For the first 4 weeks, I was not even watching on purpose. I read mouths the way you breathe. It is simply what my eyes do in a room with faces in it, and I had a wall to cut and no particular interest in the politics of Stonereach. But I saw the king, and I could not work out what was wrong with that hall. Everyone in it stood too far from him. That was the first thing. In 4 weeks, I never once saw a person come within 6 feet of King Ragnar of Stonereach, except his second, Edric, who did it with the set jaw of a man doing a hard thing on purpose. Petitioners were heard from a line on the floor. Councillors reported from the far side of a very long table. And every audience I watched ended early, visibly early, cut short, men getting out of that hall with the specific gait of people leaving a burning building at a dignified pace, and nobody looked at him. That was the second thing, and it took me longer to notice, because it is a hard thing to see. 400 people. and their eyes went to the floor, or the dice, or a point about a foot to the left of his head. In 4 weeks of watching that hall, I do not think I saw one living soul look the King of Stonereek in the face. Except me, from 30 feet up, with a chisel in my hand, for 4 weeks. So I was the only person in that territory who could have told you that the most feared alpha in the north was grey with exhaustion, and had a tremor in his left hand that he hid by keeping it closed, and had the particular flat, careful, held-together look of a man getting through the day 1 hour at a time. I thought he was ill. That is what I thought for 4 weeks. I thought, that man is ill, and nobody has told him. Because nobody is close enough to see. I met him on a Tuesday, at about the 11th hour of the night, because a woman on a scaffold works when the hall is empty, and the hall is empty at night. I did not hear him come in. Obviously, I was on the second step of the scaffold with a lamp and the letter G of a house name 400 years old, and I turned around to reach for a smaller chisel, and there was an enormous man standing about 4 feet away watching me work. I want to describe exactly what I felt, because the whole of this story depends on it. I felt startled, the way anyone is startled when a person appears behind them. And then I felt nothing else at all. No dread, no weight, no urge to be elsewhere, nothing. I looked at a very large, very tired man in a plain coat at the 11th hour of the night, and my entire body's assessment of the situation was, he looks like he has not slept in a month. So I said so. You look terrible, I said, in my flat voice, because it was true, and because I have never in my life had the reflex that stops other people from saying the true thing. And then, because he did not answer, and because from 4 feet away with a lamp between us I could see his face properly for the first time, the grey of it, the held-together look, the eyes of a man who has been getting through the day 1 hour at a time for a very long while, I said the other thing. You look lonely. And I reached out and put my hand on the side of his face, the way you do with anyone who looks like that. I have been asked 1,000 times since why I touched him. The honest answer is that I did not think about it at all. My grandmother looked like that in her last winter, and I touched her face. My brother looked like that the year his wife died, and I touched his face. It is what my hands do. It is not bravery, and it is not forwardness, and it is certainly not a claim. It is simply that a person who reads faces for a living tends to reach for one when it is that far past the point of asking for help. The man went absolutely rigid under my hand. And then, and I did not understand this for weeks, he closed his eyes and turned his face very slightly into my palm, once. The way you lean into warmth without deciding to, and stood there like that for about 3 seconds. Then he stepped back and said something I could not read because he said it too fast and his head was down. Again, I said. Slower. And look at me, I read mouths. He looked at me. I watched him work out, in real time, what I had just told him. And then King Ragnar of Stonereach said, very slowly and very clearly, in the way people do when they are trying too hard, which I have spent my whole life forgiving, you are not afraid of me. Should I be? Everyone is. Well, I said, and went back to my chisel. That sounds exhausting for both of you. I found out who he was the next morning, from the mason's boy, who went the colour of paste when I described the man I had told he looked terrible. I found out the rest of it from Edric, the king's second, who came up my scaffold that same afternoon, climbed the whole thing, in his good coat, to sit on a plank beside me with his legs hanging over a 30-foot drop, and who spoke facing me, slowly without shouting, which put him permanently ahead of about 90% of everyone I have ever met. You put your hand on his face, he said. He looked ill. Mistress, Edric, rubbed his jaw. In 3 years I have watched 2 grown men faint in that hall. Not from anything he did, from being in it. There is a counsellor who has begged to be excused from attendance, and has been. Petitioners are heard from a distance because they cannot manage closer. It is called the wait, or the presence, or whatever your grandmother called it. And it is what an alpha king has, and his has been getting worse for 3 years, and nobody can stand near him. He looked at me sideways. And you told him he looked lonely and put your hand on his face. I don't feel it, I said. I know you don't. That is what I climbed a scaffold to say to you. He was quiet a moment. It is a sound, mistress. That is what nobody in this territory has ever properly understood. Because every single one of us can hear it, and nobody can not hear it, so nobody has ever been able to say where it sits. It is below speech. You feel it in the teeth and the belly. And you have gone your whole life not receiving it, and so you are, as far as I can determine, the only living person in Stonereek who has ever simply looked at that man and seen a man. I sat on my scaffold with my chisel in my hand and thought about 4 weeks of a hall where nobody looked at their king. Does he know? I said. That it's a sound. He knows what everyone knows. That it is what he is. Edric's face did something. He has decided it is a moral fact about himself. Mistress. That there is a thing in him that people cannot bear, and that a decent man in his position accommodates it. Shorter audiences, more distance, more business through me and less through him. He has spent 3 years being very careful and very ashamed, and he has never once said the word ashamed out loud, and I would appreciate it if you did not tell him I said it either. He came back to the hall at night. I want to be honest about what those weeks were. They were not a courtship. They were an extremely tired man discovering that there was one room in his own keep where somebody would simply keep working while he was in it, and coming back to that room again and again, for no better reason than that. He talked. Mostly he talked. He would sit on the bottom step of my scaffold, the only place in Stonereek anybody sat near him, and tell me about the day, and I would cut letters and watch his mouth in the lamplight and say slower about once every 4 minutes. Which he learned to do without being reminded within a fortnight, which is more than I can say for men I have known 10 years. And he asked me things. Nobody had asked him anything in 3 years that was not business, and it turned out that a man starved of ordinary conversation becomes, when finally offered one, ferociously curious. He asked about the stone. He asked how you cut a curve. He asked, on the 9th or 10th night, what my hand speech was, and I showed him, and he was appalling at it, genuinely dreadful. An enormous man with enormous hands making a shape for water that meant something considerably ruder, and he practiced anyway, badly, for weeks, and never once got embarrassed enough to stop. That is the thing I would tell you about Ragnar of Stonereach if you only let me tell you one. He was terrible at my language, and he kept doing it in front of me. His wolf came on the 4th week, and would not go near the dais. I noticed that before I knew it mattered. The animal was enormous and grey, and it came into that hall at night, and lay down at the foot of my scaffold, with its chin on its paws, and stayed there for hours, and it was, whatever anyone in the north will tell you about it, an entirely ordinary and rather smug wolf. But it would not go up on the dais, not once. It would come the whole length of that hall to lie under a letter-cutter's scaffold, and it would stop dead at the dais steps and go around, and I asked Edric about it, and Edric said everyone had always assumed the animal was being properly solemn about the oath ring, since the ring rested on the dais in its case, and a wolf that keeps a respectful distance from a sacred object is a wolf behaving. As it should. 3 years that animal had been walking around that dais. 3 years of everybody admiring its manners. I did not know yet what I had been carving on that wall for 9 weeks, or what was quietly happening to every oath in the territory while I cut the names of the men who had sworn them. If you want to find out what a woman on a scaffold reads off the mouths of men who are certain nobody is listening, and what it costs to carry a thing out of a hall that no hearing person in the north could have carried at all, stay with me. What I saw in the 9th week is the reason there is still a king in Stonereek. I read it in the 9th week, in the afternoon, from 30 feet up, in good light, off a face I had been watching for 2 months. Lord Ansgar, keeper of the oath, stood at the side of that hall with a clerk and said, "And I got this cleanly. All of it. Because the light was on him, and his beard is short, and I had been reading that man's mouth without meaning to since the day I arrived. 12 now. 12 by proxy. He has not held a swearing in person since the spring." And the clerk said something I could not catch, and Ansgar said, "No. Let them lapse." That is the entire point. I put my chisel down. Something in me went very still and very clear. Because I had spent 9 weeks carving the roll, 9 weeks with my hands in the names of every house sworn to the crown of Stonereach, and I knew, better than anybody alive at that moment, exactly what an oath on that wall required. An oath of fealty in this territory is sworn in the king's own presence, hand on the ring, face to face, in the same room. That is the ancient form, and it is the only form. There is no swearing by letter and no swearing by proxy that holds beyond a year. An oath renewed by proxy is a courtesy, not a bond, and every oath on that wall has a term, and when the term runs and the house does not come and swear again, in person, hand on the ring, the oath lapses, lawfully, quietly, with no treason committed by anybody at all. 12 now. 12 houses whose lords could not stand in a room with their king long enough to complete a rite that takes 11 minutes. Nobody had to rebel. That was the whole horror of it, and it took me the rest of that afternoon on a scaffold to get my head around. There was no plot to kill a king, no coup, no crime. There was simply a king who had become unbearable, and a territory quietly, legally coming untied from him one lapsed term at a time, and a keeper of the oath who had counted 12 and had said let them lapse to a clerk in a voice he was certain no one could hear. And a king who believed the unbearableness was a moral fact about himself, and who had therefore spent 3 years cooperating, shortening the audiences, keeping the distance. Conducting more through Edric and less through himself, actively helping, out of shame, with his own undoing. I went to the dies that night and I looked at the ring. It sat in its open case where it had sat for 400 years, a great arm ring of iron and old gold, thick as my wrist, the thing every oath in Stonereach is sworn upon. I had never touched it. Nobody touches it but the keeper and the swearing. I put both hands on it. It was humming. I felt it come up through my palms and into my wrists and my elbows and my back teeth. A hard, low, relentless vibration, absolutely steady, the kind of thing that has no business existing in a solid piece of metal sitting in a case. It was not warm. It was not moving. It was ringing, and it had been ringing, I would learn, for 3 years. I stood there with my hands on it, and I understood 4 things at once. That the weight everyone in Stonereach felt was a sound, exactly as Edric had said. That this ring was making one. That no hearing person in the north could ever have distinguished the ring's sound from the king's own, because to a hearing person the two arrive together as one unbearable thing, and you cannot separate a note from a chord you have never once heard played alone. And that a wolf had been walking around this dais for 3 years. Edric got me the record inside 2 days, because Edric is a soldier and does not require a great deal of explanation once you have his attention. The ring had been restored 3 years ago, properly, publicly, on the recommendation of the keeper of the oath, because a 400-year-old arm ring that 100 houses handle takes wear, and the interior banding had begun to fail. The work had been done by a craftsman out of the Eastern Holdings, paid for out of Ansgar's own household, which had been remarked on at the time as generous. The generosity was the thing that finished him, in the end, though it took a year of accounting. A man who pays for a restoration out of his own purse chooses the craftsman. I want to be careful here, because I have been asked 100 times and I do not fully know. I cannot tell you what was put inside that ring. Neither can anybody. The craftsman had been dead 2 years by the time anyone thought to look for him. Of nothing in particular, in a town nobody at Stonereach had reason to visit. What I can tell you is that the interior banding of that ring was replaced with something that rang, and that it rang at exactly the register a man's own presence sits in, and that it had been resting 6 feet from the King of Stonereach at every audience he had held for 3 years, because the law says the ring rests on the dice. Ansgar had not needed to touch him. He had needed to hand him a stone to carry, and let a shamed man carry it, and count. We could not simply say so. That is the part that took the longest to accept, and Edric said it to me plainly on the scaffold. A letter cutter with her hands on a sacred object, claiming she can feel it humming as a woman, nobody in that hall will believe, because every single person she says it to has been hearing that hum their whole life without knowing it, and cannot hear it as separate now. "You are asking 400 people to notice water," he said. "They have been swimming in it since the spring. So we did not tell them, we showed them." Ansgar called the Great Renewal 3 weeks later, which was his endgame and which we let him have. He did it beautifully and entirely lawfully. With 12 oaths lapsed and more coming due, the Keeper of the Oath petitioned for a full renewal of every house in Stonereach, all of them, in one hall, on one day, in the ancient form, so that the matter might be settled and the roll made whole. It was presented as a solemn restoration. It was, of course, the opposite. He was going to put 100 lords in a room with a king they could not bear for the 11 minutes each rite takes, and let the hall watch them fail one after another, and then he would rise, sorrowfully, and observe that the bond could no longer be completed, and a territory whose houses cannot lawfully swear to its king is a territory that has no king in any way that matters. Without one hand raised against him. The hall was full, 400 and more. I was not on my scaffold, I was at the foot of it, in the good dress I own, with my hands empty. The first house came up and got through perhaps 4 minutes before the Lord's face went grey and he had to be helped back. The second managed less, and I watched a room begin to understand what it was watching, and I watched Ragnar on that dais understand it too. I was one of maybe 3 people in that hall looking at his face, and I watched a proud man decide, in front of everybody, that this was simply what he was, and that he would stand there and let it be proven. I went up the dais steps. Nobody stopped me, because nobody in that hall could have said what rule I was breaking, and because I moved like a woman with a job, which is the single most useful thing I have ever learned. I put both hands on the oath ring and lifted it out of its case. It was worse than it had been at night. It had been wound up for the renewal. Sitting in that hall all morning with 100 houses worth of ceremony around it, and the moment I took the weight of it, the hum came up my arms hard enough that my hands went half numb inside 4 paces. And Lord Ansgar, Keeper of the Oath, stepped backward. That is what 400 people saw. Every soul in that hall came forward or froze, the way people do when something irregular happens, and one man, the man whose entire office is that ring, retreated from it, fast, and put 10 feet and a table between himself and the thing he had carried at every swearing for 11 years. He knew what it did at close range when it was fully wound. He was the only person alive who did. I carried it out, 40 paces down the length of the great hall of Stonereach, with my wrists going, and my elbows aching and my grip failing in stages, and I got the doors with my shoulder, and I set it down on the flags of the yard, and walked back to the threshold and turned around. 400 people were staring at their king, the way you stare at a stranger. I could not hear what that hall did. Edric told me afterward, and could not finish telling me. What I saw was 100 faces changing at once, the entire ranked nobility of a territory discovering, in the space of a breath, that the man they had not been able to look at for 3 years was simply a large, tired man standing alone on a dais, and that whatever they had been feeling had walked out the door in a letter cutter's hands. The third house completed its oath that afternoon. In 11 minutes, in the ancient form, at arm's length, with the ring on the flags of the yard where it stayed. So did the 90-odd after it, over 4 days. Ansgar did not confess, and there was never a single crime to charge him with. A restoration is not treason, a lapsed oath is not a crime, and a man who says let them lapse to a clerk has said nothing actionable at all. What took him was the accounting, 11 years of a keeper's office, a craftsman paid privately and dead conveniently, and, once 400 people had watched him step backward, a great many houses suddenly willing to say out loud what he had said to each of them privately about a king they could no longer bear to attend. He was stripped and exiled within the season. He went, I am told, still explaining, "Here is the cost, and I will not skip it." I held that ring for 40 paces, and my hands have never been entirely the same. The hum went through the small nerves of both palms and did something to them that no healer in the north has been able to undo. The right recovered nearly all of it, and the left did not. I have the strength. I do not have the fineness. I can rough out a course of letters as well as I ever could, and I cannot do the finishing cuts, the shallow work, the serif and the fine curve, and those were the part of my trade I loved. I was 25, and I had 11 years of learning to cut a fine letter, and I spent it in 40 paces, and I have never once regretted it, and it has never once stopped being a loss. Both of those are true. I have stopped trying to make them agree, and there is a second cost, which is not mine, but which I have to carry a share of. 3 years. Ragnar spent 3 years believing that the unbearable thing was his own nature, and being ashamed of it, and quietly making himself smaller to accommodate it, and you do not get those years back by finding out you were wrong. He has told me it was a relief. It was not only a relief. There is a particular grief in learning that the thing you hated yourself for was handed to you, because then the hating was for nothing too. He asked me in the spring, in the hall, at night, at the foot of the scaffold where he had sat for 9 weeks. He asked in hand speech. Badly, he had been practicing for months, and he was still terrible at it, and he made the shape for stay twice, because the first one came out as something closer to stand, and he corrected himself and went on. He said it was the only way he could ask me a question that I would receive exactly as he made it, without a mouth to read or a voice to guess at, in my own language, with nothing between us at all. He said he had wanted, for months, to say one thing to me that did not have to travel through anybody's interpretation of anything. I have not written down what he actually said. That one is mine. I kissed him first, at the foot of the scaffold, with stone dust on both of us. It was brief, and it was warm, and it settled something in me that had been braced since I was 9 years old, and first understood that other people's ideas about what I was missing were going to follow me my whole life. 2 years on, the ring is in the yard. Not on the dais. It has its own low stone in the middle of the court, in the open air, out where the sound goes up and away and touches nobody, and every oath in Stonereek is sworn out there now, under whatever weather there is. The lords complain about the rain constantly. Ragnar has ruled, twice, formally, that the rain is not a matter for the crown. They kept the ring. That was his decision, and I argued with it and lost. He said a territory should have to keep looking at the thing that was done to it, rather than melt it down and feel better, and he was right, and I have said so exactly once and do not intend to repeat it. I still cut. Roughing and layout and the whole of the design, which it turns out is the part I was actually good at. And I have 4 apprentices, and the 2 best of them are deaf, which was not a policy and became one. The fine finishing on the roll is done by a girl named Torva, who is 19 and better at it than I ever was, and who I taught, and who reads mouths faster than I do and is insufferable about it. So the north wall of that hall is 2 hands now, mine underneath, hers on top, and you cannot see the join unless you know, and I know. Ragnar's hand speech is still bad. 2 years, he has the vocabulary of an enthusiastic child and the grammar of a landslide, and he uses it constantly, in front of the council, in front of ambassadors, badly. And I have watched hard men from 3 territories work out that the King of Stonereach is going to keep doing this in front of them, whether they are comfortable or not. His wolf sleeps in the yard now, most nights, by the stone. He walked around that dais for 3 years trying to tell an entire kingdom something, and nobody listened, and now he lies next to the thing where he can see it. I have decided that of everyone in this story he behaved the best and understood it first, and I have told him so, and he was extremely pleased with himself about it. I still wonder about the 3 years, honestly, more than I wonder about Ansgar. Ansgar wanted a territory untied from its king, and found a way to do it without committing a crime, and there is no mystery in a man like that. But 400 people spent 3 years unable to look at a man, and every single one of them decided the fault was in him, that he had grown harder, or colder, or too strong to be near, and not one of them asked whether something had been put in the room. Tell me in the comments why you think that is. I have decided it is because it is always easier to believe a person has become unbearable than to go looking for what somebody set down beside them, and I would like to know whether you think that is true of more than kings. Comment the ring if you want to hear what Ragnar's wolf did the first time a visiting ambassador tried to have the oath ring brought back indoors for his comfort. And if you want more nights like this one, a king who was ashamed of a sound that was never his. A woman who read a conspiracy off a mouth from 30 feet up, and a wolf who tried to tell everybody for 3 years. Stay close. There is more of Stonereach left to tell. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know.